Welcome to Real Estate Live. It's Friday afternoon, the sun is shining, and we're here with you this afternoon to talk about placemaking, which is a very, very important subject. Thank you very much for joining us. This is the last session of Real Estate Live for this time, and we're delighted to have, as usual, a really great panel of people with us that are going to help us through the next hour of conversation. Before I introduce those people to you, just want to let you know that we do want to hear from you. So please do start to talk to us. You can do that by either using the chat facility or using the Q&A function. We'll then be able to put your questions to the panel, and hopefully we'll have a really interactive conversation this afternoon. We're also going to be launching a poll, which should be coming up onto your screen any second. It's a poll we've been running all week. It's asking you what do you think the most significant trend for regeneration professionals in 2021 will be? So just take a few moments to answer that for us. And I'm now going to hand over to someone who I'm sure is a stranger to nobody, to Tamsie Thompson, Managing Director of the London Festival of Architecture, who is going to take us through the next hour. Thanks, Tamsie. Over to you.
Thank you. Thanks. And good afternoon, everyone. I'm really delighted to welcome you all to this session, the imaginative approach, placemaking and public realm in a post-COVID world. And as Catherine said, I'm Tamsie Thompson. I'm Managing Director of New London Architecture. And I think for all of us here today, we really think this is a key issue going forward for our cities and for our towns. And I think the pandemic has really highlighted the importance of outdoor space and the public realm to all of us. And so this is a key opportunity to discuss how councils and developers are reimagining those spaces. Think about what the priority will be as we move out of the pandemic and into the summer, where outdoors is obviously even more important, and to hopefully hear some examples of where projects are going above and beyond to repurpose space and to create healthy, inclusive and entertaining outdoor places to be, to live, to shop and to socialise. So we have a really impressive panel here today to discuss these questions and to share their thoughts and experiences with you. We've got Nick Morgan, CEO of We Are Placemaking, Ian Robinson, Strategic Development Manager of Stockton and Tees Council, Deirdra Armsby, Director of Place and Town Planning for Westminster Council, and Nick Searl, Managing Partner at Argent. So as Catherine said, there's plenty of opportunity for you to ask questions to the panel, so please do start typing away in the Q&A box. But I'd like to start by asking you, Deirdra, to tell us a little bit about Westminster's plans for Oxford Street and other parts of the borough, and how COVID-19 has impacted specifically on your public realm plans. Deirdra.
Thank you, Tamsie. I was on mute. Good afternoon. It's Friday afternoon, as you can tell. Thank you very much. It's great to be here to talk about one of those great subjects that we, even though it is Friday afternoon, could probably talk about for much longer than we have. But just to give you a very quick flavour of the challenges that we've encountered over the last year and what we're looking to do for the future. I think particularly you mentioned Oxford Street. Obviously, Oxford Street was somewhere that had a lot of challenges and was looking to be reinvented prior to COVID. And as with many features of the impacts that we've seen, COVID has intensified an effect rather than created it, really, I suppose. So we have to look to the future with a street that has to work harder, I think, to attract people in. It has to cope with what happens with office workers, because whilst Oxford Street is, premier sort of global shopping street, actually 60% of its use was given over to office use. So its mix of people, was derived from those workers, visitors, domestic, international, and some residents that live in and around that area as well. Obviously we've lost a huge amount of footfall. The West End suffered disproportionately compared to lots of suburban centres and or other centres in London. And, figures of sort of 80% drop in footfall, etc., are not uncommon. A much higher rate of vacancy in that space than it's ever really been used to. So, and those effects have been felt, but not as greatly in our sort of more suburban centres. So, there's got to be different approaches. I think that's one of the things that we've learned, how we adapt to the places that we are stewarding, what their particular, characteristics are that we should harness. So, but you'll have seen in the press last week a lot of the work that's gone on with regard to Oxford Street, because the other thing I think we've learned is we have to have very real and intense partnerships with all players in the environment that we work in. That's very much been turbocharged during COVID in terms of connections between the council and those partners. And actually the task of renewal, will very much depend on that partnership remaining as strong as it's become in this recent times. So the schemes that you've seen are about, improving place, making sure that the place is, more accessible, probably also economically, because of there's been some experience of dropped values. That's likely to bring new actors into the place and different uses, hyper diversity. It already was very diverse, but I think that's really going to intensify hyper diversity, hyper flexibility, and I think also a renewed appreciation of things like the amount of heritage character that we have somewhere like the West End. And that is a really unique selling point for us, because it's not something that gets replicated elsewhere in any other placemaking scheme. So we do understand that to be a really fantastic benefit that we have there. But we need to work hard to attract people, to make the place an easy place to get around, for pedestrians, for walkers, for cyclists, for people, and to try and shift the balance there. And of course, what we need to do is roll that through into the finite amount of, hard space that we have to work with. We don't have endless amounts of footways or even roadways. That there's something there that's got a parameter, and what is the best use of it, really? And that's the sort of thing we're doing. So we've done all the stuff with regard to alfresco dining. That's about, again, repurposing space, much of it highway, to enable that economic recovery and revival to happen. We will consider how that works in a more permanent way, but all the efforts we've made have been very dynamic and at pace, and in conjunction with the businesses, to make sure that we get on the ground what they need right now, but we're also looking ahead. And I think, just as a general principle, with some of the other schemes that we're working on, like Strand Aldwych, and also, maybe something like work we're doing in Harrow Road, we're operating that on a place plan basis. And the methodology of that is about, getting a solid, deliverable, pragmatic vision for the place, establishing dialogue with the partners and the communities. And that's not like milestone consultation events. It's steering groups, it's ongoing, it's got to be persistent dialogue, it's got to be able to reflect changes as they come our way. And then, finding quick wins in places to show the commitment, develop ways we can have partnership monies come our way, or we leverage that money from an initial investment. And that's definitely what's happening in Oxford Street. And we then get things going on the ground, much more piloting, I think, to try things out, see how they work. And also we do want to absolutely keep hold of medium and long-term plans as well. And going back to the place plan methodology, at the heart of that is the vision, and whether it's things that we do temporarily or more permanently, they've all got to fit back up to that overall objective. And I think in that way we get much better coherent places and much more contemporary for what people's needs are, because they're reflective of those views and comments that we constantly work through the programmes. So I think that's probably enough.
Great, thank you. Lots of food for thought and things to come back to there. But just moving on to you, Ian, you've got some very ambitious plans And I was just interested in hearing a little bit more about what's driven Stockton's decision to knock down part of the high street to make more public realm space, and the impact you expect that to have on the town centre.
Thanks, Tamsie. In Stockton, our proposal to remove around 300,000 square feet of retail floor space, effectively a full shopping centre, it's largely driven by a response to the kind of changing face of retail as we're seeing it currently. Obviously, we're all very familiar with vacancy rates going through the roof, trends moving towards online shopping, outlet centre, all the usual stuff. And I think in Stockton, we've long recognised we've got this quite significant structural imbalance in respect of sort of floor space, supply and demand effectively. And that's exacerbated by the layout of the high street. Very sort of long, wide, linear high street, bookended by two main retail centres, both of which are underperforming. And that really just exacerbates that disconnect between sort of vacant and occupied units, and kind of presents a much more negative picture than you'd like. So our plan ultimately was to acquire both centres and to move as many of the tenants from one centre into the other, and to redevelop the site. And I think that the redevelopment of the site, whilst the visuals and the end product, so to speak, are the thing that's got the most traction and the most publicity, and we are very proud of what we plan to deliver. I think the big success will be the measure of how we manage to sustain that traditional function of the high street and safeguard a sustainable level of retail. And I'm always conscious that we don't forget that we're condensing the retail footprint down, and that's massively important to us as a town centre. But beyond that, our plans to redevelop the site really build on a longer term commitment we had to quality of place in Stockton. In the last 7 or 8 years, we've committed somewhere in the region of 80 million to public realm and the restoration and development of cultural facilities and artistic installations on the high street. And that's largely driven by the geography of Stockton and our desire to kind of differentiate Stockton from nearby retail centres. In the Tees Valley and slightly further afield, it's very competitive, very condensed retail market, and fundamentally we need to find a way of setting Stockton apart from other retail centres and to find our kind of niche role within that broader retail hierarchy in the local area and the broader region. So we want to build on our growing reputation for larger scale events and to develop our public spaces in a way which enable us to do that. We have the River Tees flowing through the heart of Stockton, only 50 metres or so from the high street. If you're still in the high street now, you wouldn't know it's there. So you go to any major town or city in the UK or Europe with a river of that size at its heart, it's fundamental to how that part of the town functions. So we really want to embrace that, the proximity of the River Tees, bring it into the town. Big part of the challenge we have is the 4-lane road between the high street and the river. So we intend to bridge over that sort of 60 or 70 metre-ish wide tunnel that'll enable you to move directly from the high street down to the riverside, where you've got about a 10, 12 metre height differential. But the public space that we hope to create, the urban park, will be home to a new municipal headquarters for the council. So we'll anchor that in respect of the physical development of new office floor space on there. But the public space ultimately will build upon our commitment to that quality of place and the high quality environment.
Thank you. Again, got lots to come back to there, but just moving on to Nick Searl, and I just wanted to ask you a little bit more specifically how important this imaginative placemaking is to creating mixed-use developments, and specifically, I think, what sort of impact do you expect that to have on attracting future office occupiers?
Thanks, Tamsie. I think the word imaginative placemaking is really important. I think to some degree that the term placemaking has become slightly abused, and I think one of the first things I want to say is to try and dispel the notion that some people seem to think that placemaking is about design and things, and that is kind of part of the process, but it's only one part of the process. For me, you know, for our business, we have spent the last 20 to 30 years on very large scale projects, and that is unique and gives us an opportunity that you don't get when you're working on single buildings or much smaller projects. So we've had these very large projects where we've had the opportunity to make the place in which our buildings sit. And so it has been absolutely at the forefront of our minds as what is the nature of the human experience that we're creating for people when they come there, whether they be a worker, a visitor, a resident, or whatever purpose it is that they're having. What is the experience that we're creating for them? And partially that's about what you see and the bench that you can sit on and all the rest of it. But it's also about sound. It's what are you hearing? It's about what kind of energy is there. Often when we talk about a place that we've really enjoyed being, we're actually talking about the fact that we were with a whole group of people that we really enjoyed being with. So how you're creating opportunities where, you know, people can kind of come together. I live down near Brighton, and one of my favourite places is the North Lanes of Brighton. And when you put it on a plan, it's terrible. It's too narrow. It's, you know, all sorts of things. But actually the experience of being there is an incredible human experience on a sunny summer's day. So how do you capture some of those experiences? So, you know, we're in our projects, you know, we try to think about that. How do you curate the spaces? How do we enliven and activate them? How do we bring events that people enjoy coming back to that are there to attract not just, you know, one demographic, but across a whole range? And we also think very, very carefully, and this again is sometimes I think something that's forgotten, is placemaking is about the interrelationship between the public spaces and the ground floors of the buildings. And we often forget that. And a lot of our buildings, you know, it's kind of easy with a restaurant in the sense that you can put some chairs and tables outside, but so many of our buildings are very, very defensive, particularly office buildings, and they don't add anything to that overall experience. You're not allowed in them. People come out and kind of disappear. How do you get a much more cohesive relationship between those things? So, you know, our business and our projects are built around ever increasing imagination being required to what is the nature of the place into which we're going to put our buildings. And from an office perspective, it is more vital now than ever. So I spent 8 years of my career, it was pretty tough in the beginning, trying to attract office occupiers to come to King's Cross. And as I say, in the early days, that was really difficult, but always throughout that whole process, we talked primarily about what was the nature of the place we were going to create. We told people where their staff would go at lunchtime, where they would meet their friends, how they could shop, where they would be able to go to the theatre or the cinema or whatever. We didn't really talk about the inside of the office building or how big the floor plate was. And, you know, we've now got Google, Facebook, XTX Markets and DeepMinds, who are, you know, very advanced technical businesses here. And in a way, you kind of say, well, why are they here? They could be anywhere. There's plenty of office buildings around. They're here because they're trying to attract the best talent from around the world to be here. And that talent wants to be in a place that they're proud of, that they can bring their friends to, their business partners to, their family to, and that becomes part of the whole work experience for them. So it's critical on whichever way you want to look at it. It's increasingly an important part. And of course, COVID has made it even more important. And I think that will probably last for some time.
Thank you, Nick. And Nick Morgan, just sort of looking ahead, I'm interested for your perspective on how important you think placemaking will be as we recover from COVID-19, and perhaps more specifically, what you think we need to do, what's needed to drive this forward.
I mean, whether I sound biased or not, but for me, it's the heart of the recovery. I've been saying it for a long time. I use the term, it's the new anchor of any scheme, the public realm. Everybody, the pent up demand, I know everyone's using that term probably overly at the moment, but it's there, and people are thriving for experiences. And, our main competition is obviously digital, and digital for me is still quite traditional. It's very transactional. The experience is pretty poor. Whereas, I'm hoping to see this is the injection that we've always needed. I think retail has been quite archaic in terms of the experience. Maybe premium and, the luxury category is not the case, but I think everyone's thriving for that experience. So everything we do is looking at, halo events, we call them, and we've developed this dashboard of 52 KPIs. And I think it's really, really important to set those KPIs in advance of doing any sort of placemaking enlivenment program, because you need to measure success. I think traditionally for years, I still see activations now, and the KPIs are way too soft. People talk about very loose footfall figures, or, some of, they do some very loose exit polls. For me, it has to be, set KPIs. It's so important to see what that success looks like. And I think there's some really interesting data. I read something the other day just aligning to the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, and never in British history has there ever been growth in that sort of experience economy. So things like theatre halls, concert venues, the public and trade, it boomed after that. And I think people are thriving. We're social creatures at the heart, and we want to get back into that environment. And I think, as Nick just alluded to, but employment decisions where we live are made on place, and what that mix is, whether how the master plan looks like. So I think it's really, really important. And I think now is the opportunity. Often in anything, the evolvement happens where someone's, their back's against the wall, huge suppression or depression. We're in that now, and I think it's the injection we need to reinvigorate town centres, schemes. I think one of the caveats for me, though, is it does need, more wider stakeholder engagement. A lot of the schemes we've worked on, obviously it's very boundarized by that particular developer wanting us to, do events just within their boundary. But for me, I think it needs to be a citywide approach. Obviously that brings challenges over budget and who funds certain elements. And obviously with COVID, we've been looking at much more, wider reaching. So whether it be an art installation, trying not to center around one particular object or entertainment zone. It needs to be far wide reaching. And I think, as Public Health England are now suggesting, it's endemic, it's not a pandemic. It's something we're going to live with for the next 2 or 3 years at least, or forever. It'll be a societal thing that we have to, like the flu, an annualized jab. So I think it's a real opportunity. I term it as live architecture. You have all the hard architecture that exists within the scheme, the high streets. And for me, placemaking is a very temporary thing, and it's enlivening and bringing people back to whether the high street or the public realm. So I think it's so important. And I think, unfortunately, developers too often have obviously termed placemaking and used it. For example, putting a coffee shop into, their office building, for me is not, that's just a need, and it's an F&B operator. So for me, it is genuine, and it has to be of, importance, and it has to drive destination footfall to that, and we're looking at global, interesting developments. It can't be what some people call surprises, like, small things, the dreaded days of people walking around on stilts. It still brings shivers down my spine when people say that's placemaking. It remains at the forefront of mind for maybe 3 or 4 minutes. It has no benefit to anybody apart from maybe the stilt walker. So I think for me, it is about genuine programs and investment. And obviously I appreciate at the moment, this is one of the most challenging times to be investing in things like enlivenment programs, with obviously rent rolls and etc.
Thanks, Nick. And there's a couple of things I'd like to pick up in a minute, particularly around your KPIs and how you measure success. But before we do, I just wanted to pick up on something actually the other Nick Searl mentioned about creating that sense of place, and the kind of what Nick Morgan just described as the sort of the hard architecture, the hard placemaking, sometimes potentially being a barrier to creating that sense of space and getting that flow between public and private. And just like, I guess, a little bit more from you, Nick, on that, and then maybe some reflections from Deirdra and Ian from a local authority. How do you perceive your kind of wider asset base?
Yeah, I mean, if I've understood the question right, so let's put it this way. I'll use King's Cross as an example. Sorry if I say it too many times, but it's because it's obviously something that we've been very closely involved with and evolving. And I think that word evolving is really, really important to the answer I'm going to give you, because we started this creation of experience and opportunity to visit King's Cross before there was any architecture, in the sense we hadn't built any buildings when we first started inviting people in. So the university opened, and we opened, firstly, a restaurant that was in an old petrol station. Secondly, we started to put on street food, and this was 2011, and it was new. It wasn't something we were seeing anywhere at that time. So we started putting that on. And we started to put on various different events and activations in our one bit of public space. And there were no other buildings. It was just a giant construction site. And people came. And people came largely actually from the local community. They started to come because they were coming into a space that they'd lived next to for 20, 30 years, but they'd never been in there. They'd never seen it. So suddenly we were creating the opportunity to come in, but also the opportunity to do something while they were there. And that, back to Nick's point about, what constitutes events and activation, what we found that there was things that we could do for an hour on a lunchtime while people were having food, which kind of just created ambience, through to we put on with Sadler's Wells a great big theatrical production in a load of cabins that were stacked up under a load of gas holders and put it on for a week. So we did everything. It required all of these different layers of energy activation experience to drive different audiences and give different people reason to come in. And what that did was it allowed us to present what we were doing with the whole place to a really wide audience very early and just build a little story. And people would go away and say, have you been to? And they would tell people, and we created ambassadors for what we were doing before we'd even done it. And that was through bringing in people. And I think actually that way of thinking is actually an interesting way of thinking about how you emerge from a pandemic. Because we're trying to give people reasons to come back. Yes, there will be pent-up demand and all the rest of it, but people want quality as well. They want good stuff. They don't just want, as Nick said, just some people on. They want good stuff to come and see. So how can we create that, not just on, in a state like this where we can control it, but how do councils work with developers, with local people and communities to create the opportunities for that tiered a series of events and activations and things to occur. The architecture with a capital A, you're the LFA, I'm an architect by training, is not actually that important.
Mm. And Ian and Deirdra, sort of responding to that, maybe going to Deirdra first. How do you get that to happen, and how do you overcome any of the barriers that the hard architecture offers? Oh, mute.
Just as a golden thread issue, I think what everyone's getting to here is about, that marriage of the physicality of place with, the emotions and attachments that people build to it, whether they work there or they live there, or, it's sort of by reputation, which, maybe parts of the centre of Westminster certainly are. We know that people in Australia know what Oxford Street is, for example. And so I think, though, what the pandemic has taught us about is, people want their areas to provide for their needs, don't they? And their needs are a constantly changing thing, as they are for all of us as we move through different phases of our lives. We might live somewhere for 30 years, but we will use it differently during the course of that time. So I think for us, one of the big things, and it goes to your point around is there a barrier to sort of, architecture with a capital A? We have to be so much more adaptable now and open to that, and all those prescriptions around retail frontages, having a prime frontage and a secondary frontage. You can do some things in the secondary, but not in the primary. And every single planning authority, probably for the last 25 years, has had probably an identical policy around those issues. Yet in so many ways, we all operate in very different conditions, have different populations with different needs, younger populations, older populations, and they all had to live with the same sort of strictures around what was acceptable and how quickly you might be able to change it. So I think that's one of the lessons for us is being uber flexible and more open-minded about things that can happen, and the opportunity to try things out, accept that we might get things wrong, which I think public authorities have been very wary of doing traditionally, and also that we extend our reach, because as some players might fall out of the market of doing things they've done for many years, they're now perhaps not able to, they're in dire straits. And I think there are some things that the public sector has to step into. So going to Nick Morgan's point around, the activation, the nature of events and the nature of the wraparound care that you give to a place, because it's not a one-trick pony. We're planning on doing some stuff in our Strand Aldwych project, which we've changed a lot because of COVID. It's not a linear sort of rollout of a sequence of physical change and then we create a place and we're going to have some activation to it. We're actually going to have to do the physical space really quickly to as good a standard as we can, and then bring in the animation to it and see how it lands. We've got an opportunity similar to Ian's to connect back down to the river as well, and using light, sound, noise, art installations, all those things. But I think the thing we all have to be a bit careful of is there's many dimensions to place, and actually it's quite hard to deal with all of them at the same time. So I think we need to know what's going to work for a particular environment, how scarred it is and how much repair it needs, and to sort of lead off on that point, because we don't have endless resources, both in terms of ourselves, but also clearly money. But I think, key to all of that is making sure the partners that are able to keep on moving with you in kind and in cash, you keep those working with you.
Thank you. And Ian, how do you see this playing out in Stockton?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting listening to Deirdre's experiences and views there, because I think Westminster and Stockton probably couldn't be at more opposite ends of the spectrum in respect of footfall, and perhaps some of the kind of the affluence of the general demographic of those who were visiting. But I think a lot of the challenges remain consistent across both areas, and I think that ability to have flexible space in order that you can create the right environment at the right time, so to speak. We at Stockton, as I alluded to, a growing reputation for larger scale events, which is lovely. It's great, and it brings a lot of people in a very short space of time. That space needs to function the other 350 days of the year, and it's got to function in a way that meets local need. It remains attractive. It remains authentic, I think, and in order to do that, I think you've got to kind of play to your strengths in terms of your local assets. And I talked about the river. We put a great store on our kind of railway heritage and that type of thing in Stockton, arts and culture. So it's about authenticity, I think, in those spaces, but without trying to get too clever about it, in the sense that they have to be accessible and usable day to day, but also be able to, as I say, accommodate those big bang events and those big bang occasions, if you like, where you can have a lot of people in an area at any one time. And to back that up, there's obviously Deirdra touched on again the policy position that is fundamental, and we've all been round the block on that a few times, I think, and still are in some cases to try and get that right. And there probably isn't a right answer, other than to say you need to be prepared to be more flexible around that, as well as as we come out the other side of the pandemic, all being well. Who knows what's in store, and I think it kind of depends on what your view is as to how we'll bounce back, as to how you'll respond to that in terms of your placemaking agenda. But yeah, it's really heartening to kind of hear your experiences there, Deirdra, because they are very similar to ours, albeit, as I said, at opposite ends of the spectrum.
Thanks, Ian. And Nick Morgan, I'm interested to hear a little bit more about those KPIs and how you identify what success looks like. But I'd also like to sort of add in a question in the Q&A from Rosie Cade around how you make these events not just outdoor but indoor, and how you potentially make them free and accessible. So it's, I suppose, 2 questions in one there for you, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of KPIs, it's driven by the developer often with our sort of steering and guidance. I mean, the obvious around footfall, but for us, it shouldn't just be around footfall. It's around, genuine footfall. Dwell time's really, really important. There's lots of data that suggests if you're getting over sort of 45, 50 minutes of dwell time, you generally get a secondary spend, whether that's in F&B and retail. Anything shorter than that, it comes down to that sort of Instagrammable culture. So people are in and out if it's an art installation based, and they don't really engage in that place. And other things are things like sentiment, so social sentiment, measuring that on social media to see, whether whatever that enlivenment program is positive, neutral, or negative. Increase, things like increase in travel time against base. So that's really important for us. We did a scheme in the West Midlands, and there it doesn't sound like much, but we added 11 minutes, of travel time to that audience. But that's adding 900,000 people to the catchment area during that enlivenment program. So, that is significant. Things like uplift in F&B, as long as we can get those sort of turnover, it needs to be very transparent, but things like that, another scheme we did, we saw a 21% increase or uplift in F&B turnover during those 10 days against their base, year prior. Obviously, there are other influencing factors that you can't always, like weather obviously has a big play on the outdoor installations. And in terms of sort of Rosie's question, so we've done some work. We work with probably sort of 50% of the London estates. One of our clients there, we did a commercialized activity, but alongside that for 6 weeks, we did a community project, which effectively was funded by the commercial entity. So the commercial thing was a fairly straightforward series of concerts, and the community program was therefore, given revenue, and we also brought on brand partners to help underwrite that cost. And it's really, really important, to be, not to be completely elitist. And, that is a challenge in some London estates. So, and getting the community to have full ownership. I think there is a danger sometimes, and we get criticised for it, of going into regional place, obviously being a London agency and suggesting these East London, Hoxton, thinking that we're too cool for school. That isn't always well adopted regionally. So I think it's really, really important. And we spend a lot of time on sort of stakeholder mapping, and we have a mapping tool that goes and speaks to whether it be local theatre groups, community groups, and getting them to help inform our ideation program. It's so, so important, because if they don't have that ownership, they're not going to advocate it. And it needs localism at the heart, I believe. So that's how we funded some activity. But I appreciate some, it does need to be free often. And at the moment, we're all very challenged in these times. Where is that revenue coming from? Because it isn't necessarily service charge, repatriation.
Thanks, Nick. And just picking up another question in the Q&A from Peter Heath about these sort of temporary structures and installations and things that are placed in and around cities to accommodate these things. How do you, I think Peter particularly raises in sort of the heritage context, but generally, how do you make sure that they're appropriate and appealing and fit for purpose? And I wonder if I could go to Deirdra and then to Nick Searl, as 2 slightly different locations that do a lot of this sort of thing.
Look, I think we'd be very upfront and honest about the fact that, you know, we moved to do things quickly, and that involved a lot of temporary materials, if you like, to get some good effects going for us with regard to, you know, street closures and creating better spaces in the centre of Westminster in particular. And by its very nature, you know, they're probably not the most compatible materials to the environment that they sat in. And I mean, obviously everybody did that across London in, you know, creating temporary cycle lanes. And I think that was absolutely the right thing to do at the time. I think the move forward piece it is obviously something we're looking at that right now, about how we might move into things that are medium term, perhaps, and then what that uplift in quality of those materials and pieces of kit need to be in that environment. I mean, I think that there's also some things that are, you know, off the shelf and easy to get your hand on that actually are much more attractive. So, you know, planters instead of plastic barriers, you know, perform more than one function. And where we're able to do that and it works for other reasons as well. Often, for example, you know, if we have to secure places from hostile vehicle mitigation reasons, then the planter becomes the better temporary piece of kit than the plastic barrier, because clearly it's much more flimsy. So again, I think it's about bespoke measures, you know, for the environment that you're in. And we absolutely strive to make those as good as we possibly can, but sometimes we've got to do things quickly, and we would acknowledge that we use what's at our disposal, and that doesn't always be as good as it can be, but we're sort of remedying that now from the experience that we've had.
Next up.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point that the last sentence that Deirdra said. Just, you know, we're learning from that experience as we go along. I mean, that is definitely something that we have over 30 years. We've done quite a few things wrong, and of course you learn every single time and you improve and you make them better. You also have this interesting dilemma. So for us, a lot of the residents who've bought homes at King's Cross have said to us they're coming here because we love the buzz, we love the vitality, we love the energy of this place. And then you put an event on and they all complain because they now live there. So it's actually quite different from being a visitor to somewhere to being a resident somewhere.
The Notting Hill Carnival effect, basically.
Yeah, exactly. So you have to respect those sensitivities. But back to my point earlier, and for us, I think where we have got it wrong in the past is where we have allowed commercial interests to drive it too hard, and we've not been strong enough in maintaining what our values are and what it is that we are trying to achieve. And the second thing is when we have allowed quality standards to drop. And those two things now we are absolutely quite rigid about. And quality comes in many different ways. I'm talking about the quality of the experience for people. It doesn't mean that everything has to be terribly posh. It's just that it has to be a quality experience. So, you know, the other thing I'd say, just back to the earlier point, is that we have a large covered canopy here that was part of the heritage buildings. It's not actually a heritage structure as such. It was built in the early 1900s. But we decided to keep that structure. And actually now it's one of the most used spaces. You know, in normal times, 3 or 4 days a week, we will host a canopy, the canopy market under that canopy, which brings lots of people, have food and people selling things. And then we put other things on, you know, every single day there's boot camps going on under there and all day. And it allows a big chunk of our public space to be usable all the year round. So trying to accommodate that and thinking about that, you know, it's difficult for people who have existing, you know, how do you put that into Oxford Street or Stockton? I don't know. But, you know, where we're thinking about things from the scratch, as we are currently doing at Brent Cross, for instance, we're thinking about how do we accommodate some kind of covered space, public space into all of this, so we can have free to access events that are just all year round.
Yeah, absolutely. We were actually discussing this the other day with a colleague, how lucky you are with your covered space, hard standing and electrical points. You're well set at the moment. Just exploring something Deirdra said right at the beginning about this sort of perhaps maybe a change in the balance between central locations and suburban locations, and how potentially footfall might have, well, certainly has currently shifted out of the centre and back out into suburban areas. And then maybe, is there a new dawn for suburban high streets and other areas? I'd like to hear a little bit more from Deirdra, but perhaps all four of you might respond to that from your different perspectives.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think that my perspective as a lifelong Londoner, you know, born and raised in the city, I have 4 children in their 20s, you know, completely love London. You know, there is a big issue with affordability and accessibility, but in terms of what people who want the city to provide for all stages in their life, and I'm one of them, I think that we shouldn't set this up as a competition between the centre and the suburbs. I think everywhere has its opportunity to do something for you in the city, if you like. You know, that suburban condition that you might want to have certain part of the week, and then, you know, you might want to do something completely different in a completely different place come the weekend, and the other way around. I think the trends around how many of our commuting suburbanites will continue to commute at the same intensity as they did before, question mark. I think we really don't know. I think it perhaps won't initially go back to the levels that it was at before, but it will come back, I think, you know, post the 21st of June, to a degree. But I think there's also then opportunities for people, say like me, who had been travelling into the centre of London 5 days a week. And if I'm actually only going to do that 2 or 3 days a week, I'm probably more inclined to go and do it at the weekend, whereas I wasn't before, because, you know, been there and done that all that time. I mean, there's lots of implications for that. But I do think that everywhere's got a role to play. And I don't think it's going to help any of us if we set it up as a competition. But I think that the grounds and the functionalities of suburban places and central places are all in a state of flux. And I think it will put a spotlight on your, you know, suburban high streets and the parks, how they're looked after, because they've all been used more intensively. What people want out of those, they want a bit of that central London grooviness, you know, to be on their high street. They want those shop fronts painted all different colours. I think there is a higher expectation for the suburb, and I think the centre's challenge is probably a bit more about, you know, really quite deep foundation structural reinventing of itself as retail falls away, and those more experiential and, you know, wider diverse uses appear on streets like Oxford Street, you know, and that there may be cultural things that happen there when previously they were, you know, museums of retail, as it were. So I think everyone's got a job to do here, and I think we need to do it collectively and make sure that we get a better whole piece of suburb plus centre, so that London as a whole continues to, you know, be a fantastic place to live and work and have a good time, really.
Thanks. And Ian, are you experiencing similar things in Stockton?
Same but different. I think it's probably fair to say. You know, I certainly wouldn't want to make any sort of comparisons to some of the challenges of kind of central and suburban London in the same way we do in Stockton, certainly on the same scale. But the role and function of our town centre in Stockton is really critical as that kind of community focus, that community hub for activity, and also within that broader Tees Valley and northeast region. Stockton in itself is a little bit unique as a town or a borough, I suppose, of its size. We have 6 town centres in there, so whilst the focus for us currently in the imagery, etc., that's been out in the national press recently is on Stockton, we have a broader ranging investment programme across all of our town centres. So we're looking to create versions of Stockton which meet the kind of characteristics and the requirements of our other town centres. So we're spinning a lot of plates in that respect and trying to balance up each of those town centre needs. But those challenges are consistent across the board in that these spaces need to be interesting, attractive, and they need to be able to kind of retain that footfall and those visiting numbers in order for them to be a success.
Thanks. And Nick, Searl, you've obviously talked about King's Cross, but you've also got Brent Cross. Am I allowed to call that suburban?
Call it what you like. Everybody has their own version of it at the moment. I think this is such a fascinating. You know, Boris, when he first became mayor, there was a big push towards bringing the suburbs of London up, and I think that can be applied to a lot of the regional cities as well. And I think COVID, it's an irony that COVID, I think, is going to end up being something that actually strengthens the towns and villages of our main cities, and actually does, as Deirdra said, create some challenges for the centre. I think in the end, it's all about a kind of a vibrant ecosystem for a whole city. I don't think any of us really want to go back to just slugging, miles and miles and miles, 5 days a week from one place to another, which means that those areas that are in the suburbs and maybe even beyond the suburbs of the cities actually have more people, have more footfall, have more opportunity for businesses and their high streets to strengthen. And I think that's a really good thing. And I think places, we're looking at Brent Cross, we're also looking at Tottenham and other places there that are a little bit out of the centre. And I personally think that what we were already doing to try and create places there is going to be strengthened by the opportunities that are going to come out of COVID. I think the city centres will need to focus on how they bring visitors. If they're going to have a reduced footfall from people who are working there and not working as many days a week, getting back to tourism, particularly in London, but other regional cities as well, and really having a strong story about that, and also national tourism, internal tourism within the UK is going to be really important as well. So I think there's going to be a really interesting dynamic and an evolution of how the city ecosystems work. But Deirdre's absolutely right. This is not about a winner and a loser. If we get it right, the whole thing wins.
So it could really be a balancing out, perhaps.
I think that's more likely, but that creates a challenge for the centre.
Yeah. And Nick Morgan, I'm interested to hear your perspective, obviously working for a number of clients around the UK, and how those issues are playing out, if it's a kind of consistent pattern or you're seeing some variations.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with all the other panelists. They all have a role to play, and I see the sort of local, whether it be suburban. I mean, there are sort of, London's a host of villages in itself. For example, Wapping is very granular, but I happen to live there. That's almost like suburbia. And that high street, has never been busier, obviously, during this time, because people's been much more, localized. However, I do think, it's got a function to play. And I think you'll see more community engagement. People are thriving for, that sociability. And I think I've never seen people more engaged and interested in the heritage of their local area, but also wanting to, know more about it. I mean, there's so many forums just where I live, but I see it, I used to live on the Roman Road that had the same challenges. Unfortunately, 2 or 3 years ago, somewhere like the Roman Road, they were intent on sort of destroying the heritage, and it was all around this horrendous term gentrification. But, that seems to have surpassed us. But I think it's really, really important to harbour the heritage and not just ignore it. And I think, we're going to see it's going to be highly competitive, but those big schemes, or say, the city centres, it's almost going to compete with attractions, and families are going to be thinking in half day, intervals almost, or filling that time. So I think retail in itself, the whole environment, the experience needs to improve, but so does the offer. And people will then go to, and not just because Nick's on the call, but like Argent is a really good example of, a well thought out sense of place. There's always things going on. You almost wake up on a Saturday and if you go there, you're going to have some form, not necessarily entertainment, but engagement. It's an experience. The architecture helps, does definitely help promote that experience. But I think it's going to be, and retailers do need to improve that. And whether we're going to see, schemes full of brands, and the retail as we know it in the traditional form will not be so much at the forefront. It'll be brands taking the tenant agreements, and it'll be about tactility and brands showing off that, and then the transactional piece will still remain online. So I think, they all serve a purpose. And I think it's a really, really exciting time. We just need to inspire. And this is what, so I'm not saying we needed COVID, but I think sometimes you need horrific situations bring out the best in us all, whether it's the creative, and rethinking. And this trajectory has been happening for years, hasn't it? This isn't new. And I think now, the realization's at the forefront of everyone's mind of how we improve, and the High Streets Task Force is one area that hasn't really completely mobilized yet, but will do soon. So for me, it's exciting, but I know financially there's a huge pressure on all of us, including, my business. We've obviously not done as much as we would in normal years, but already we can see since Monday, it's been horrific, but good, the amount of briefs coming across our desks.
Lovely. And we're nearly out of time, but I was just going to ask everyone what the key driver they think is to bring people back into town centres in the immediate. So the last few minutes, if I could just have one thing from each person, starting with Ian. What do you think the key driver is to bring people back in to our town centres?
I think the obvious answer is people have got to feel safe. But I'm certainly of the view that we're creatures of habit. We like social interaction. That much is clear, I think, from what you've seen over recent months. So it's going to be about quality, and it's going to be about safety for me. Quite a bland answer, but I think fundamentally you get those things right, and you'll be on to a reasonably successful position, I think. Yeah,
absolutely. Deirdre?
I think it's about variety and authenticity, really. I agree with what Ian has just said, and on top of that, I think you have to give them a reason, as it were, and some of the things we might have relied on, they've gone away. We all have to work a bit harder to make sure that variety and accessibility of the place is heightened for the future.
Nick, Searl?
Food, music, culture. Get all those three right, do it high quality, people will come.
Certainly sounds like a good basis for a fun day out. And Nick Morgan.
I think very simply, we need to inspire to mobilise people, away from their traditional environment of being at home on their computer in a digital environment. Let's get them back enjoying experiences, as cliches as that sounds.
Thank you. So really, it just leaves me to thank the panel here today: Ian Robinson, Deirdra Armsby, Nick Searl, and Nick Morgan. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tamsie, and thank you to all of our panellists. As Tamsie says, a fascinating conversation, and one which I'm sure is going to go on and on and on. And that brings to the end this week of Real Estate Live. And it's a great place to finish, actually, because as we head into the next 3 months and what that's going to bring, it will be very interesting to see how, as we start to emerge, hopefully, out of lockdown, exactly how this will all come about, and how we will all start to enjoy places again once the world reopens and the UK and London reopens. So it really just leaves me to remind everybody that's watching that we are coming back in June. And as it happens, we're coming back just as we go into lockdown. lockdown. We're literally coming back from the 14th to the 18th of June. Sorry, as we come out of lockdown, I should say, fingers crossed, from the 14th to the 18th of June, when we're obviously at the moment expecting that 21st of June will be the day that we are all allowed to act normally again. But let's wait and see, because we're not 100% confident yet, and we do need to wait and see what the next few months brings. But we will look forward to revisiting this conversation, as well as the many other conversations we've had this week, because it is going to be a very interesting 3 months, and we'll be in a very different place, I think, in 3 months' time. And this conversation and others will, I'm sure, continue. So thank you all very much for joining us this week. Thank you to our partners. Thank you to White Label and the team for making all this run so smoothly. And we look forward to seeing you all, I'm sure, before June, but if not, then. So thanks very much again, and goodbye.